Good afternoon, 7th grade. Hope this Friday, April 24th, finds you well. We're going to be on the bottom left-hand corner of page 396 on section 25.2, Years of Change. Today's reading is from page 396 to 399, and we will do the section review 25.2, all questions. There's just 5 of them, shouldn't be that difficult. So this section is going to go over several years of events that happened in the world after the formation of all these different unions. And after the end of this, let's see if these unified countries, this unified organization, if there's anything good that comes out of it. So we're going to start with the Persian Gulf War, trouble in the Middle East. While world leaders were distracted with events in Eastern Europe, a major crisis developed in the Middle East. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein, dictator of Iraq, invaded the tiny oil-rich kingdom of Kuwait. Hussein planned to make all the Arab nations surrounding the Persian Gulf subservient or slaves to him. When Israeli secret agents discovered that Hussein was close to developing an atomic bomb, President Bush chose to enforce the UN mandate to send troops to liberate Kuwait and protect the other Arab nations. President Bush compared Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler. Both dictators were determined to conquer innocent people and steal their wealth, and they were also murderers of their own people, where Hussein has been proven to have experimented on new weapons of mass destruction. To test their efficiency, he used them on his own people, such as nerve gas. Terrible, terrible man. Operation Desert Storm. As in past UN actions, the United States provided most of the military muscle for liberating Kuwait. About 500,000 American troops, including Air Force and Navy units, were shipped to Saudi Arabia to liberate Kuwait. Saddam Hussein refused to comply with the UN's January 15, 1991 deadline to withdraw. On January 16 and 17, the United States with the UN coalition forces began a massive air offense against Iraq. This was known as Operation Desert Storm. For nearly 6 weeks, coalition forces took the offensive and began round-the-clock bombing of Iraqi troop positions. In the awesome display of new technology, including highly accurate smart bombs and cruise missiles, the Air Force was able to select and destroy specific military targets with minimal harm to Iraq's civilian population. The high-tech weapons developed and stockpiled during the Reagan administration overwhelmed the Iraqi military. On February 24, 1991, the American and coalition forces, including British and French forces, invaded Iraq while Israeli forces stood ready to assist. Unlike the Korean War and the Vietnam conflict, Congress gave full support to military commanders to direct the Persian Gulf War. Operation Desert Saber, the massive ground offensive led by General Norman Schwarzkopf, so overwhelmed the Iraqi resistance that President Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th. Kuwait had been liberated, but Iraq and Saddam Hussein would remain a smoldering ember in future Middle East events. Operation Desert Storm was a great triumph for the American military and the cause of freedom. The war only lasted 2.5 months, from January 16th to April 6, 1991, making it the shortest war in U.S. history. As socialism seemed to weaken its grip on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, it strengthened its grasp on the American people after Democrat Bill Clinton won the presidential election of 1992 with only 43% of the vote. The remaining 57% was divided between President George H.W. Bush and the independent candidate Ross Perot. Despite raising taxes and promoting abortion, homosexuality, gun control, and more government programs, President Clinton maintained a strong U.S. influence on the international stage. Clinton's administration, in conjunction with the UN trade embargo, helped reinstate Haiti's democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Next, the Clinton administration arranged peace talks in Dayton, Ohio, for the warring factions in the Bosnian conflict. When the Serbian Muslim conflict moved into Kosovo, Clinton encouraged NATO forces to assist the United States in subduing the Serbian-initiated violence. President Clinton also attempted to achieve a balance of peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. Changes to Central America, the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, a key juncture for international shipping, cuts 8,000 miles off the journey from New York City to San Francisco. Overlooking geopolitical consequences, the Senate, under the Carter administration, ratified the Neutrality Treaty that gave complete control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanians on December 31st, 1999. In the aftermath of this decision, Chinese front companies obtained long-term leases of strategic ports on either end of the canal. This has raised national security issues for America. Mexico, a democratic republic, was governed by the Institutional Revolutionary Party from 1929 to 2000. During that time, Mexico's economy was heavily socialized, with the government tightly regulating the major industries. However, at the century's end, the PRI suffered its first major defeat in 71 years. The year 2000 marked a historical moment in Mexico's development. For the first time since the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, Mexico hosted what was largely a fair presidential election. A historic president for the country then took place in December of 2000 when the outgoing government, the PRI, peacefully yielded its power. In its place, Vincent Fox Quesada and the Pro-Catholic National Action Party, or PAN, rose to prominence in 2000. Previously a very successful businessman with Coca-Cola, Vincent Fox had great ambitions for Mexico. He worked closely with President George W. Bush to improve trade relations between the United States and Mexico and to reduce drug trafficking and illegal immigration. Critics observed, though, that illegal immigration actually increased during his administration. U.S. concerns increased when Fox began calling for open borders between the United States and Mexico and protected rights for illegal Mexican immigrants. When Fox's term in office expired, he was succeeded by the PAN nominee, Felipe Calderón. Changes in Russia also occurred at this time. As Russians adjusted to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin followed Mikhail Gorbachev as the president of the newly organized Commonwealth of Independent States. He became a key transitional figure in Russia's shift from communism as he worked hard to dismantle the Soviet Union. Yeltsin's 8 years in office from 1991 to 1999 were filled with economic reforms, unrest in the Russian Republic of Chechnya, nuclear cooperation with Iran, and personal ill health. Yeltsin moved that Vladimir Putin follow him as president. Vladimir Putin, 2000-2008 administrative years, reversed many of the Russians' new freedoms while he was in office. Russian television stations and other media nationwide came back under the control of the state and broadcast propaganda during election cycles. Putin selected Dmitry Medvedev, his protege, to follow him in office while creating a new position of leadership for himself. Medvedev was elected to office on March 2nd of 2008 in what is considered another undemocratic Russian election. The greatest political event in the latter part of the 20th century was the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. The political, economic, and moral failure of communism was finally exposed to the world, but communism is far from dead. Communists still rule in China, the world's most populated nation, and other countries including North Korea and Vietnam. Indeed, some Russians feel that communists still influence events in Russia. Gorbachev's prophecy. On May 6, 1992, former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev spoke to a crowd of more than 10,000 people at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, the very spot where Winston Churchill had warned of the onset of the Cold War in 1946, coining the phrase Iron Curtain to describe the communist denomination of Eastern Europe. Gorbachev declared the Cold War to be officially over, stating that the world was no longer divided between the East and the West, but between the rich and the poor countries. He said, "We live today in a watershed era. One epoch has ended, and a second is commencing. The new era," he continued, "would be a whole world community with environmental cooperation, disarmament, and economic sharing." In 1994, the exiled Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia. His message was far different from Gorbachev's. Solzhenitsyn insisted that the only hope for the world was a spiritual rebirth. He was not happy with what he saw in Russia. Solzhenitsyn's message was the same as it had been in 1983. And if I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too, I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have still forgotten God. The modern age, 1500 to the present, has seen a tremendous increase in knowledge of all kinds. Books have multiplied, art and music have increased. Science has produced an endless array of technological devices that can be used for advancement or destruction. Representative government has spread to many parts of the world, but dictatorial governments have spread as well. England, along with America, proved to the world during the modern age that pure representative government, when it is accompanied by spiritual revivals and national righteousness, is a successful form of human government. However, if people are not personally governed by righteous principles, Even the best form of government will eventually crumble and turn against true liberty. Today's cultural exhibits these signs as national governments are submitting themselves to the growing movement toward a one-world global governing system. So that concludes today's lesson. Make sure you do these 5 review questions here at the end. Once you're done with that, I hope you guys have a good weekend. I will see you next week.